Okay, let's dive right into this explain with a pretty wild historical question. How in the world did one single work of fiction spark a massive, highly organized propaganda war in 1850s America? Today, we're digging into a fierce cultural battle from the decade just before the Civil War, specifically looking at how fiction was literally weaponized to defend the institution of slavery. To make sense of this literary war, we're going to follow a quick roadmap. We'll start with the catalyst for the controversy, check out the retaliatory Southern response, deconstruct the core biased themes of that plantation literature, see how they tried to justify slavery, and finally unpack the lasting legacy of this battle.
Right, so let's kick things off with part one, the catalyst, Harriet Beecher Stowe and the Fugitive Slave Act.
So back in 1850, the U.S. passed the Fugitive Slave Act, and this law was incredibly strict. It essentially mandated the return of escaped enslaved people to the South, even if they had successfully made it all the way to free states. And it didn't mess around with the penalties either. We're talking a $1,000 fine and 6 months in prison for anyone who knowingly helped a fugitive. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe, a Northern abolitionist, was just absolutely infuriated by this. Her sheer outrage led to the serialization of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1851, which then dropped as a full book in 1852. It was a rapid escalation where a fictional text practically marched the entire country right up to the brink of the Civil War in 1861. To really wrap your head around the impact of Stowe's work, consider this number: 300,000. That is how many copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin sold in the United States during just its first year. And over in England, another 1,000,000 copies. It exploded into the best-selling novel of the 19th century, literally the second best-selling book overall, right behind the Bible. It took the simmering debate over slavery and turned it into an absolute firestorm. Now, as you might expect, this didn't just spark polite political debates. It caused an immediate massive backlash. Proponents of slavery completely denounced Stowe's book as abolitionist propaganda and a blatant lie. Just listen to this critic from Tennessee, quoted in the Ohio State Journal in 1852, calling it the best fabricated lie in the 19th century. This intense, visceral shockwave is exactly what fueled the coming propaganda war. And that sheer, unadulterated outrage brings us right to part two, the organized, retaliatory Southern literary response, or the birth of anti-Tom novels. So we're talking about a very specific, highly coordinated genre known as plantation literature, or anti-Tom literature. These were 19th century pro-slavery novels penned by Southern authors with one very clear, explicit goal in mind: counteracting Harriet Beecher Stowe. They actively tried to portray slavery as something that was actually beneficial to African Americans, claiming that Stowe's horrifying depictions of abuse were totally overblown and factually wrong. If you want to know how fast this counterattack mobilized, check out the timeline. Incredibly, 8 different anti-Tom novels were published in 1852 alone. Think about that for a second. The exact same year Stowe's book hit the shelves, a coordinated literary defense force cranked out 8 full-length rebuttal novels. Over the next decade or so, we saw anywhere from 20 to 30 of these pro-slavery novels hit the presses. Prominent authors of the day, folks like William Gilmore Simms, Caroline Lee Hentz, and Mary H. Eastman, really led the charge here. In fact, Eastman's book, Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, became a massive hit within the genre, moving 20 to 30,000 copies on its own. All right, now we reach the absolute core of our explainer, part 3, deconstructing the specific biased themes these plantation authors used to try and sanitize slavery in the public imagination. This genre aggressively weaponized a few very specific, highly biased tropes. Almost universally, these books featured a quote-unquote benign, well-meaning white patriarchal master alongside his pure, virtuous wife. And together, they were shown presiding over enslaved people who were patronizingly depicted as inherently childlike. The overarching goal here? They wanted to convince readers that the plantation wasn't a site of brutal forced labor, but rather a benevolent, extended family-style environment. It was a total head-to-head clash of narratives. On one side, you have Stowe portraying slavery as a horrifying, abusive, dehumanizing system that literally broke bodies and tore families apart. On the other side, plantation authors were crafting this fictional utopia. They were arguing that African Americans were simply incapable of functioning without white oversight, deliberately designing their fiction to reassure white readers that this brutal system was actually just a natural, necessary hierarchy. A really perfect example of these themes in action is Caroline Lee Hence's 1854 novel. It's fascinating because she actually tells the story from the perspective of a Northern woman, an abolitionist's daughter no less, who marries a Southern slave owner and suddenly has this realization about how great the system is. But they didn't just rely on utopian imagery, they actively stoked fear. Hence's novel really hammered home this looming threat of violent slave rebellions, claiming it was entirely the fault of Northern abolitionists meddling where they didn't belong. Which leads us right into part 4, the justification of slavery, focusing on these supposedly just and equal Christian defenses. Because beyond just painting pretty fictional pictures, this literature relied heavily on trying to frame slavery as a morally and religiously regulated institution. A huge argument at the time, one that Stowe herself documented, was the religious defense. They actually argued that the institution of slavery wasn't inherently sinful, as long as it was regulated by the Christian gospel. Basically, their claim was, hey, if the master is a good Christian who does his duties, the system is perfectly just. They were desperately trying to separate the horrific localized abuses from the core institution itself. But Stowe definitely wasn't going to let that slide. In 1853, she dropped a massive nonfiction follow-up called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. She basically brought the receipts, a huge collection of actual legal documents, court records, and hard facts. She proved that no matter what these Southern novelists were making up, the actual legal realities stripped enslaved people of literally all basic human rights. Zero legal right to marriage, zero right to protect their own kids from being sold. The master held absolute unchecked power, and the enslaved had absolutely no legal recourse whatsoever. Stowe's nonfiction follow-up just ruthlessly exposed the hypocrisy of the whole thing. While Southern defenders were out there citing benevolence and laws that supposedly protected the enslaved from overwork, the actual legal codes allowed for unmitigated brutality. Stowe pointed out statutes allowing forced labor for enslaved people that was up to 5 hours longer per day than the absolute maximum allowed for violent convicts serving hard labor in a penitentiary. We are talking about grueling, legally sanctioned 15-hour workdays under the constant threat of a whip. So where did all of this lead? Let's move to part 5 and look at the legacy of this unprecedented literary war, its demise, and how we view it today. The timeline for this entire genre is incredibly distinct. The anti-Tom literary movement just hit a brick wall and abruptly died off right at the start of the American Civil War in 1861. Once the ideological battle over slavery moved out of the newspapers and novels and spilled over into actual bloody warfare on the battlefield, the need for this highly specific fictional justification just vanished overnight. Today, when historians and literary scholars look back at this decade of writing, they do not view it as a legitimate alternative perspective. Impartially speaking, all of these anti-Tom, plantation literature novels are universally classified strictly as pro-slavery propaganda. It was heavily biased, misleading information, manufactured quickly and deliberately to promote a deeply entrenched political and economic agenda. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to take away from this explainer. Over 170 years ago, one single fictional story was able to ignite a massive, highly coordinated propaganda war that completely altered the political discourse of an entire nation. So, in our modern age of hyperfast media, algorithms, and fragmented realities, how easily can powerful, coordinated narratives still shape or completely distort our own view of reality today? It's a stark reminder that the battle over truth and fiction is definitely nothing new. Thanks for tuning in, and keep questioning the narratives around you.